You need light?
Do you need light?
That's not asking about Satan.
You need light?
You need light?
Yes. It's recording. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless this gathering. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept our fasting. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us during these blessed days. So inshallah today we'll continue that second week of the series, kind of building on a lot of what we covered last week with the theory on self-determination theory. So today I'll speak about 3 different topics. I'll try to bring them all together in the end, teaching, learning, and motivation from classical and modern perspectives. And so there are really few major things I wanted to cover.
Click on. Yeah.
So what I'd like to do for a few minutes, not very long, was to do a quick survey of classical Islamic education. How did Islamic education develop from the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for the first few generations? Then we'll start moving towards talking more about, well, what does a teacher look like in one sense, according to a theory of a Murabbi. And then I want to go into some modern theories of human development and motivation. In particular, I'll talk about motivation from a theory that I work with called expectancy value theory. And the last, we're going to have hopefully a discussion that I hope brings all these components together so we can discuss kind of what should Islamic education look like in America for our youth. So to begin, at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when one might wonder, well, what did education look like? There was actually very little. There was 2 really major places where people would learn. One of them was in the private halaqah system, which was very normal. We know in the house of Al-Arqam, Al-Arqam, we had those halaqat. That was one example. And of course, as Islam spread, more and more people had these halaqat, and the Prophet ﷺ would allow different Sahaba to teach these. The second way, which was kind of one of the more formal ways, was in the sufa of the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. There was a platform in the back of the masjid, which was known to become a de facto school. This is a very informal school in that there was not like a set period of time, there wasn't a set curriculum, but different people would come, both the Sahaba who lived in the city and outsiders from different tribes. They would come and they would learn, sometimes over a period of months, and there'd be regular students who would live in the masjid, or they would come maybe just for a weekend or 2, learn what they need to learn, and then go back to their tribes. So there really wasn't much of a formalized curriculum. Now in the sufa they would teach poetry at times for language purposes, and they would teach mainly the basics of Islam, aqidah, of course, fiqh and akhlaq. So, but at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, as he passed away, the Sahaba, they added a few things to that existing system. The first, which was already at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, was the desert education. And I think this is a very interesting conversation today. How many of you are aware of attachment parenting? Raise your hand if you know of attachment parenting or heard of it. Yes, no? A little bit. That's the idea that today is very common, that a lot of young sisters have, that it's become popularized through Dr. Sears. You've heard of Dr. Sears, a very famous pediatrician, who says that children should be attached to their parents for the first few years of their life. And literally they should sleep with their parents in the same bed. They should never have their own room. Right? They should literally be in the arms of the mother as much as possible, or close to the proximity of the parents. Now, if you compare that actually with this notion that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself went through, and the Sahaba they mostly went through, their notion was that there are certain things that are parental responsibilities of education. That includes the parent's job is to give the kid good language as a youngster, so, from an infant to about the age of 5 at least. So the kid should have basic knowledge of the language through poetry. They should have certain skills like being courageous. If it's a boy, to be manly, to be good to people around you, to be hospitable, generous, integrity. A lot of these character strengths, we'd say. These were not learned in schools. There were no formal schools. The idea was that we would send the children off to the desert, right, away from the big cities, and they would learn from in the Bedouin culture a lot of these things. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, right, he went and he had Halima, right, as his wet nurse who was there and taught him a number of these things. So at that time, the idea was that the parents would send the kids off. They would learn these things in that setting. When they were older, they would come back, and then perhaps there would be some more formal schooling. What was that formal schooling? At the time of Umar ibn Khattab, the idea of the Kuttab came about.
Excuse me.
Yes.
There is a question regarding the desert education.
Sure.
Parental responsibility. Was it designed just to teach males,
That's a good question. I am not aware.
Because manliness,
Yeah.
it looks like.
Well, that's only for boys, of course.
Yeah.
Manliness in particular. But I mean, the idea is these character strengths were thought to be highly valued by the Bedouins. So if they were the masters of these things of integrity, hospitality, generosity, courageousness, then it was best for the parents to send their kids out for a few years, learn the language from them, which is more pure. Send the boys in particular. Yeah.
So that was the center of education. So I mean, females that have no share.
I'm not aware if females went to desert education.
Yeah.
Are you?
No, I'm not.
I don't know.
And this is consistent with what they used to do.
Yeah.
Killing young girls.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be a valuable
Yeah.
resource to send the girls out if they're going to be killed when they were 3 or 4 years old in the first place. Right?
Okay.
So that's interesting. Yeah. So then Umar ibn Khattab, when he came about, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was busy with Hurub al-Ridda and many things. The scholars of Islamic history say not much educational changes happened during his time, other than the compilation of the Quran, which still was not yet published, but it was compiled during his life. But with Umar ibn Khattab, what happened was all of a sudden Islam is opening up in all these cities all over. So in Iraq, in Kufa, in Baghdad, right, in Jordan, in Palestine, Islam is everywhere. At that point, there needs to be some way to educate people. So the idea of a kutab, which was a small kind of almost like an elementary school, was established within the masajid. So still, there was no idea of a school. Parents would not take a child and send him to a school the way we send kids to schools today. So in the masjid, the parents would be there. There was no age group, no age grouping. And it's a very informal setting where they would learn the basics of pretty much literacy, poetry, and it was religious education, nothing beyond that. They'll get those things in the desert as a baby, come back and do a little bit of the kutab. But what's interesting is Umar changed one element, which was now a teacher became a paid position. And that's actually a very important change, because all of a sudden now he sent teachers to different regions. So in one hadith, Umar sent 10 teachers to Kufa to run the kutab there in Kufa. So now a teacher all of a sudden has social value. A teacher gets a salary, and that is going to have a development, a cascade, in that people are going to seek education because now there's a possibility of getting a job as a teacher. So that's the second major development that happened. Okay. So I'm going very fast because this is really not the bulk of the presentation, just to give you a snapshot. By the Umayya era, the era of the desert education slowly was coming to an end. It wasn't becoming as common anymore. And I'm sure there's larger political and sociological factors that influence that. But the idea is that, well, there was a new way to teach your kids these values that were that were very important. So if you wanted to have manliness, courageousness, good character, right? You have a better language. These Umayyads decided that they're going to have a system called the Al-Mu'addib system, where there would be highly valued teachers, many of them who migrated from the deserts to the cities. They became private tutors. And so there's many different narrations we've heard of where Harun al-Rashid, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, and all these other Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, they actually would go and seek out the best instructors to teach their children. And the famous story of Imam Malik, when the Khalifa came to him, Harun al-Rashid, and said that, please come to the palace to teach my kids these skills. He wanted him to be his mu'addib. He said that, al-ilm yu'ta wa la ya'ti. That knowledge is something which people come to, knowledge doesn't go to places. And so Harun al-Rashid at that time sent his kids then to Imam Malik to learn. But this was also an important shift, because now that idea of desert education, which was kind of, everyone used to do it, was eliminated. But now, in order to have mu'addib, you had to have money to hire a good quality tutor. So also now you start to notice a difference in classes. So the masses weren't accessible to these mu'addibs really, because they were for the elite, more or less. The other thing that happened that was also interesting in the Umayya era was these halaqat that initially were very unstructured became much more structured in subject matter. So there would be halaqat for nahu, or halaqat for tazkiyah, or halaqat for fiqh in the masajid. And then as well, the kutab became separate institutions. So before they were part of the masjid, but Imam Malik and others were instrumental in moving out of the masjid, and there were different reasons for this. One of them was that Imam Malik said that when kids are in the masjid, they defile the place. So you have little 4- and 5-year-olds running around the masjid. Right, at that time, he thought it would contribute to making it a sanctuary would be at stake. So the kutab now became separate, usually attached to the masjid, but it had some autonomy in terms of what it taught. Now during this entire era, there was no such thing as state-administered curricula. It was completely independent. That's a huge point in the early era. As we move a little bit forward now with the Abbasi era, the thing which they introduced was the idea of two different types of gatherings. They had these majalis of munadara and majalis of mudhakara. And the Abbasi era was known for this time of argumentation. So it went from being in the kutab, where just you sit and you listen, there's a lecture, there's skills that you learn, to slowly became more about the questions that are asked and challenging the people who are in those settings. And so debating was something which was very commonplace. It was commonplace in schools, in the kutab, it was commonplace in the marketplaces, it was commonplace in the courts. And they've written about why this was important. So one reason is that it was good because the Abbasis wanted to create a culture of intellectual, Baghdad to be an intellectual capital. So in Baghdad in particular, which was the capital at that time, to have these large debates in the courts, to them was important that spread a culture of this is the way that we have discourse in our community. The second thing was they found it to be also something which would give them power. If you're the Khalifa or you're a governor and you're coordinating these large debates between major scholars and people are attending them and then you're judging those debates, well, that pretty much puts the power in the hand of the judge at that point. So while this was very common, there was not widespread agreement this was a good way to educate people. So while they felt it was important that people should understand different ideas, conflicting ideas, and viewpoints, it was good in that it was an atmosphere where teachers were checked academically. So if an alim, a scholar, was to make a statement, a fiqh opinion, or an aqidah position, or anything else, anyone felt comfortable saying, well, why is that the case? And I know we have these talks amongst ourselves that, there's within certain groups in even Southern California or in Muslim Ummah, questioning is encouraged. In other groups, it's extremely negative, that you should not ask at all. The sheikh is the authority, and it would be, the student should have the audacity to dare ask the sheikh a question. So the Abbasids were not like that at all. The other reason why it was considered to be a success, it was very entertaining. And I know I've had this talk with Sheikh Mustafa Omar in Masjid, the IOC. If you're familiar, they do these debates regularly. They talk about different things. And I have also become a little bit critical of them. And I speak to them, I say, this is just entertainment. People come and they want to sit as to is halal food, is it good to eat or not good to eat, right? Should we vote, should we not vote? Should we have a khalifa, should we not have a khalifa? And it's more of like to sit and have popcorn and kind of evaluate the quality of the arguments rather than learning. So, of course, the government, that might also work in their power to entertain the masses. So many scholars, they criticize this method though. They said, look, this is not good for learning, right? It's not good because first, the student shouldn't be that bold to start really just, out of his place asking questions when he doesn't know the basics. They said it could build bad habits of arrogance, of being overly argumentative and cynical. And then, of course, Imam Ghazali and others went on a lot more talking about there's a point when this should be healthy. That certain students, when they've reached level of maturity, they should be allowed to, they should have a voice to argue, but not everyone should be, shouldn't be a blanket rule that people can talk in this fashion.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
What is munazara and
so munadara is that term for disputation and argumentation, whereas the mudhakara were considered more to be just mutual. It was more like, it's not arguing, but it's like mutual reminders and advice and testing. So in the case of sometimes in the majalis of mudhakara, if a scholar was coming to be for a position, there'd be a public defense almost of his knowledge. So you'd say, okay, they'd ask him questions about different masail, and they wouldn't go back and forth, but it was more of a test of his knowledge. And even other gatherings where it was just more of like of hadith and these things. There was no arguments in those gatherings, but the munadara were specifically organized for that debate to occur. The other thing that happened during the Abbasi era was the madaris opened, and the Nizam al-Mulk was very famous in Islamic history. The madaris nizamiya were opened, and that was probably the biggest development in terms of education. So all of a sudden now we went from having these masajid had halaqat inside, and there was a kutab next door, but now formally the idea of schools came about. And what's interesting about the schools is first they were run by endowments, and this is in political reasons for this as well. If the masjid, and I was talking to Abu Tariq about this previously, if a brother gives money to a masjid, the money goes to the masjid. At that point, he cannot say, he has no control over what happens in the real world, right? That's what should happen in the Islamic ideal. We know now, someone gives $1, this says, I'll only give $1 if you do what I tell you to do, and if you don't do it, I pull the $1 back. Right? That violates the rules of wealth. But in this sense, the masajid became the madaris became separate endowments because it allowed the person who gave the endowment to have a voice in how the school was run. He knew if he was in the masjid, he doesn't have that voice any longer. He has no ability to plan out the school's curriculum and the instructors. Also, now when we have independent madaris, libraries were established. And that's also a huge development, is that now knowledge became accessible to students in a way it was not accessible before. And functionally, these became colleges of law. That's what it became, where these schools, there'd be 4 different corners, and in each corner of the school, there'd be a different madhab being taught, formally. So you'd have a corner for the Hanabila, right, and for the Shafi'iyya, for the Malikiyya, and the Hanafiyya. But what's nice is that there was a culture where that was okay to be in the same place. Right now, of course, you go to certain parts of the world, and it's like a huge, like how dare you teach a Shafi'i madhab, right, in a Hanafi country, right? That's the issue. Not let alone in a building that's has one school of thought. And then the important point is that at this point, these were madaris were typically more or less religious. These were places people went after they finished the kutab. So you learn to read, you learn to write, you learn poetry, you learn those basics. You graduate to these madaris where you learn formal law and aqidah. But if you're going to go into medicine and other crafts, there were other schools for that completely. So still there was no merging of secular and religious traditions for the most part. And then eventually universities opened up as well in that era. Cairo was the first in Morocco, and Al-Azhar, of course, in Egypt. Question? Okay, so if there's a question, we can ask. Some of the hallmarks quickly of that early first few centuries. Number one, and this is huge, is there was complete autonomy by the state on educational choices, completely. The state never interfered with curricula. They never interfered with the appointment of instructors. And really they left it, other than collecting their taxes and zakah from the localities, they had no influence on the education of that place. Now, early on, Umar ibn Khattab had paid teachers, and there were certain times that occurred, but more or less this was an independent institution, and it was completely at the choice of instructors, of people who gave the endowments, and of those cities who designed their curriculum. The other thing that's important is really lecture-based instruction at that point. So in these halaqat, you'd mainly have the sheikh or whoever's in charge teaching, and other than the questions that students would ask, there was really no other form of instruction. There was no projects, right? There were no other methods. The students also had immense autonomy. This last week was a huge conversation in SDT about autonomy. They had absolute autonomy to choose their teachers and their topics. So the student went to a madrasa, or he went to a halaqah. He could say, oh, I'm going to sit with this teacher for this subject. If the teacher is good, I'll stay with him as long as I want. If I think the teacher's terrible, I'm leaving after the first class, right? And he could sit with the teacher until he felt he learned enough from that teacher. He would then go to another teacher. So he could shift schools, shift teachers as he wanted to do that. Also, in those schools, there were no grades and degrees early on. The method of just graduating someone was typically by ijazah, where a teacher would say that you have mastered this material. It was more or less informal. And that ijazah, that permission from the teacher, was his card to say that this is something that's certified. And that, of course, is debatable whether someone trusted that ijazah or not. And even today, this is a huge issue. You can get ijazah very easily. I remember I had a teacher of mine, a hadith teacher. He's now in Minnesota, actually. He's probably one of the best teachers in the world in hadith. He said when he went to India, people wanted, because he was a huge scholar in Egypt, they were throwing the sheikhs would say, take our ijazah, we want to be connected to you. He's like, you don't even know what I believe in. You don't even know anything about my knowledge. So this idea of ijazah, of course, is very loose, and it is something which is heavily debated. Halaqas, although they were informal in terms of people could come in and out, they did have their norms. So their norms were that once you're in a halaqah, yes, you can walk in, you can leave if you want, but they're seated in a very structured way. The senior students would sit closest to the teacher, right, and then more distal students who are newer would sit on the outside, and there were some norms as to behavior etiquettes and so on and so forth. And of course, in these halaqas, the encouragement of asking questions was immense. Something I noticed in a lot of different statements is there was this emphasis on avoiding boredom from hadith the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ all throughout the first few generations. And I think this is important because there was choice. If a student has a choice to stay in your circle or to leave your circle, well, you have to keep them engaged, right? If you have no choice and you have to sit here, I can be as boring as I want and you can't go anywhere. So the teachers were very, very concerned with, I'm going to make sure that I teach in a way where someone doesn't get bored. So they would often limit their lectures to an hour. So Sufyan ibn Uyayna used to say this, Shihab al-Zuhri, they always used to say that, look, we're only going to lecture for a short period of time, lest our students get bored. And they would say, once we'll lecture to our students, their eyes start to kind of waver, at that point we're going to stop. Because we know if they get bored, it's bad for their learning. right? And it's also bad for the culture of that halaqah as well. The last point that I think is kind of important is that there's a lot of debates over discipline in these settings. So if you're in a madrasa or if you're in a halaqah, is corporal punishment allowed? Is the hitting of children allowed? And majority of opinions said yes, although they said it's not good, but they would say they would limit it to a certain amount of, like, you can spank him like 3 times or 10 times. But there's a lot of debate over this in the early generation, whether it should occur or not. You'll see later on, this was a lot more, a lot of scholars differed with this and said that the teacher has no business hitting the students. Yeah, question.
So when I listened to your lecture, I was imagining, until the last point came in, you're talking about small kids, as opposed to when I thought when the learning occurred, there were 15, 17, and 18.
Okay, good question.
So
let me separate them out.
Yeah.
Good. So the kutab system that I mentioned earlier, that was for young kids. Oh, the question was about at what age are all these things happening, right? So is this happening for young kids or is it for older kids? So again, there's autonomy. Every country and every city had different norms of when kids started school and when kids would graduate. So Imam Bukhari, in his example, he finished the kutab when he was 10, right? He was done. In other cities, you would not start until you were like 8 or 10. Some you would start at the age of 5. And this is the same thing we see today in the world. So in the US, you start kindergarten or transitional kindergarten at 5. In Europe, in many countries, you start at 7. These are regional differences. So the kutab was a system for those that we called the elementary school, and the madrasa was more of like the secondary school. So you would not go to that madrasa until you were at least 10, 12, 13, and you were proficient in reading, writing, grammar. You probably memorized Quran by that point. And one of the things that was actually unfortunate was that some of the systems had established, if you don't finish the Quran, you don't move on. So if you're not a hafid, you don't get educated. And that was because it created obviously a huge disparity in terms of knowledge between, and Somalia still does it, by the way. I mean, you can't start elementary school in Somalia until you're hafid of Quran. And so some kids start at 5, some start at 7, some start at 10, some may actually never get to elementary school, right? Well, yeah.
Now this is education, this is Islamic education. Islamic education. Are you going to talk about different cultural education?
I will as I move forward. But the history, I just want to talk about the history of Islamic education because the other one is just, there's way too much information to cover. So, and it's not my expertise. So now I'm going to move a little bit further along. We're still kind of in the, in the first few generations, obviously a little bit later. But a few major scholars I wanted to highlight their views on education. Because a lot of the topics that today happen in academia, these have been had for the last 1,000 years in the Islamic world. And so one of the ones I want to bring up is Ibn Sina, right, the great medical scholar in particular. And he had a few major points. The first that he emphasized, so we had the mu'addib system I spoke about, where people felt that it was desirable to hire a mu'addib as a one-on-one tutor for your kid. So Ibn Sina comes along and he says, actually, no. Group education is the preference for how students should learn. And he gave many reasons. He said, first, children learn from one another. And this was debated earlier on, and I'll get to that later. Imam Ghazali and John Locke and other people, they have different views on education. But his notion, Ibn Sina, was that you cannot take a child and teach him in a vacuum, because that is actually limiting his experiences. When you put him in a group setting, kids learn norms from one another. And in his opinion, they should have been grouped according to nobility. So you should not send your kid to a school or in an atmosphere where there's kids who are not well cultured, because they're going to learn the bad habits. So he said you put your children in an atmosphere where there's other good kids, they will learn from each other. That's the first thing. So then he said that also it's important to develop social skills and friendships. And the third, he said it's not motivating to sit one-on-one. He felt that if you're sitting one-on-one, the pace of instruction may not be the best. There's less of a motivator. If you have your friends in a class or your peers and you see the pace of instruction is fast, or you see that other kids are engaged, that could also pique your engagement in the topic. So he felt that one-on-one instruction was actually detrimental to learning.
Yeah. Question. You know, Ibn Sina is known for being Ismaili and Batini. How can we put this within that context?
So I don't think it matters, because a lot of the stuff is being influenced by the regions that they lived in. So they're learning a lot of these things from the secular non-Muslim systems they're a part of. So is the idea of group education. So he's not giving you what should be learned necessarily, right? He's talking about general human development.
The style and the approach.
Yeah, and
Okay.
so I think it's irregardless of religion.
So you can take it from anyone.
Yeah, I mean, we learn in academia from non-Muslims all the time, because they're not. This is not a value-laden judgment, right? This is more of like their ideas on human development,
Okay.
and motivation. So then he spoke a little bit about curriculum. I don't want to go into that. He spoke about the qualities of a teacher. So he mentioned explicitly after religion, A teacher has to know how to socialize and be familiar with child development, and he has to know educational methods, and he has to have knowledge in moral education. So he actually began to stipulate that it's not just a knowledgeable human being, but if he doesn't know child development, if he doesn't know educational practices, then that person's not qualified to be a teacher. That was also another development that he had made. Ibn Khaldun came along a little bit later, and you find him to actually be incredibly scathing in his critiques of the system that I had mentioned of the madrasa. So Ibn Khaldun, right, the great Tunisian scholar originally, who had lived in many different regions, in Spain in particular, he came along and really, if you look at his muqaddimah, slammed the traditional method of education at the time. So two things that he thought were very, very problematic, I know Al-Tariq will be happy with because Al-Tariq agrees, you'll find, is that he said the great number of scholarly works are a huge obstacle in attaining scholarship. And he gave an example as a Maliki Qadi. He's like, look, you have to know the Mudawwana, which is of course the big book. You have to know all of its shuruhat, right? All of its explanations by Al-Baji, right? And by Subki in the Shafi'i school. You need to know these encyclopedias to such an extent, only then are you considered like a mufti or a qadi. He goes, this is detrimental to developing scholarship in people because these books are redundant half the time, and you'll spend your whole life in this and you still won't know everything. So he started to really say it's not important to master all these different books, the big ones. Then he added, nor is it good to study all these little mutun. So typically students would study a tiny matan that is like 20, 30 pages in every subject. So in hadith, there's a matan, right? In fiqh, there's a matan, right? In aqidah, there's a matan. And he said this is very detrimental to instruction. And he started to explain why. Because you take these students who are teenagers pretty much, they're learning to be scholars, and this has been, you've taken thousands of pages of material, condensed it in 20 pages, and it's so confusing. I remember studying in Al-Azhar. To study one line, the sheikh would explain for 3 hours. One line, and I remember one sheikh, he passed away, rahimahullah, a great scholar, he died actually, he was martyred during the revolution earlier on, he took 8 years to teach one matan in Shafi fiqh. 8 years to teach one book, because it's so complex and mu'aqqad, the expressions, that it was just, and I remember this, 9 out of 10 students, they sit in the first lecture, they said, this is not for me. And many of the imams that live here as well, we talk about this. They're like, I'm going to be in Egypt for 4 or 5 years, or in Mecca or in Medina. I'm not going to finish this book for 8 to 10 years. And this was a way that would just they would run away from these sciences. So usul fiqh, I'm going to study that method for 4 years? No way. Or in logic or these things. So he felt this was very detrimental to good scholarship. And also the reason he mentioned, he said it introduces to you the final result of a science is introduced way too early in these mutun. It's not developed sequentially. Without going into his theory much more, he used to advocate studying one subject at a time. He used to also be very critical of people who would study the auxiliary sciences way too long. So we have people who study Arabic forever. He goes, this is useless. They study usul fiqh forever. He was not a fan of these. He said all of these auxiliary sciences are tools for the real sciences. So you learn Arabic so you can understand the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Hadith, and so on and so forth. Right? So learn Arabic to that level of mastery. If you're going to learn usul fiqh, it's so you can derive fiqh. Right? If you're going to learn any of these sciences that are auxiliary, you only study them to the extent that it serves you in studying the other ones. And the last thing was he was very critical about spanking children, extremely critical. And said this is actually, he went on from a good perspective, he said it develops the worst character. It teaches students to be deceitful and lying. He said, look, if you take a student and he's not behaving in a school gathering and you spank him, the first thing he's going to do is figure out how can I avoid the spanking the next time? How can I lie and deceive my teacher to get out of any sort of punishment in the future? So he was very, very critical that he felt it developed a bad habit. Yes.
I don't know, maybe later you'll talk about it, but so far it looks like the norm for the new Muslims who are joining Islam, let's say they're non-Arabs.
Okay.
Was the norm for them to pick up the Arabic language and study Islam?
Oh, great. Okay. Good question.
Or would they be studying Islam with their language?
Good. So the question has to do with learning the Arabic language. So this is what the historians say was one of the greatest accomplishments of the Kutab system. So in the Kutab system, in the masjid or outside the masjid, anyone would come. New Muslims, converts, even if you're older, even if you're younger, and that's where the Arabic language was propagated. So through the Kutab system, you take these 5-year-olds who are foreigners, in a couple of years they become proficient, and so everyone has equal access to the education. It was a huge hallmark of the Kutab. That was really important. So yes, all of this was being done in Arabic in most of the regions throughout the empire. So Ibn Khaldun then he goes on to mention And I'm presenting this because I think it's important to understand that regionally there was a lot of autonomy, and there's a critique of what each culture would do. So he, in his Muqaddimah, spoke about 3 different societies. He spoke about Morocco, Spain, and then Africa, and he spoke about what did they do? What was their system? So this is in the Kutab. So what did kids learn in Morocco? He said in Morocco they were obsessed with teaching the Quran and the Rasam of Quran. And that was what they spent years and years on, and until they attained mastery, they would never move on to hadith, fiqh, poetry, or anything. So again, in Morocco, if you didn't memorize the Quran, and you did not know it's Rasam, when I talk about the Rasam, you have to know exactly, when the word Rahma is written with a ta marbuta as opposed to with a regular ta, right? Or when is it going to be an alif maqsoor, right? So it's all the intricacies, right? I remember in Al-Azhar we were tested on this. It drives you insane. Tell the 6 times in the Quran where the word Kayla is written this way and it's not written that way. Like, why does this matter? Well, it doesn't matter anymore. But of course, back then, when people are doing a lot of handwriting, this is how Qur'ans are being distributed. That's very important. Right? But again, if you're not a hafiz and you don't know the Qur'an's writing, you don't learn hadith, you don't learn fiqh, you don't learn any of these things, right? In Spain, he said that they used to focus on reading and writing, but they were very relaxed. They would use the Qur'an, they would use poetry and other forms of composition to inform this. And then they spent a lot of time with handwriting. And then he mentions in Africa, they would teach both Quran and the Sunnah simultaneously. They also would teach scientific norms, so arithmetic and other things, and then they would teach handwriting. Then he goes on to critique. He said that...
Didn't he go to...
He went everywhere.
No, another area, the East.
So in the East, unfortunately, he said...
about the East also.
He did, but he said, I do not have much knowledge of what they do, so he narrated it third hand, like second hand. So
I think he preferred the East.
He wasn't confident enough as to what they did for me to tell you here, but I will tell you the manhaj. Okay. So his critique was, he said people from Morocco.
When you're referring to the East, what do you mean? You mean the Middle East?
Syria, Iraq,
that. But he just calls it the East. He doesn't call it by the region. So he calls it Africa. I'm assuming he's talking more, about Sudan and some of these regions that are around. So he said that people from Morocco and people from Africa will never learn good Arabic language. So he was very critical of their language, and of course he went to these regions. And he said, why? Because you take a child who's 5 years old, and the basis of his language development is through the Quran. He goes, you will never learn to speak properly or to write properly because this is something which is unique to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you'll be awkward in your pronunciation, in the way that you speak. And it reminds me, I was laughing when I read it, because when I was in Egypt and we learned just like classical Fusha as foreigners, and you go on the street and you speak it, people laugh at you, right? Like this is an awkward way of speaking. It's so, you kind of learned this archaic way of speaking. And his point was the same. That's not a natural way of speaking, right? Imagine someone speaking with like the Quranic style, right? It doesn't, it's awkward, right? So then he actually went on and he said, and he loved and preferred Ibn al-Arabi's opinion. He says, look, Ibn al-Arabi was very critical as well, and he said this is what should happen, so his views. So these debates were happening over curriculum. He said Arabic and poetry should be the first things that are taught to a child. He said after that, they should learn mathematics deeply. Only after they know Arabic, poetry, and math should they move on to the Quran. Right? And this is Ibn al-Arabi, the great Maliki Qadi. This is not some like secular or some other non-religious person. Right? And then he goes after the Quran, you go on to Aqidah, Usul Fiqh, and these are happening in the madrasa. So this is going to be early on, you do these things. And then he says a nice quote, right? He says how thoughtless our brothers are, and that they teach children the Quran when they are starting out. They read things, they do not understand and work hard at something that is not as important as them as other matters. So what did he mean by that? So his whole premise in that was that, look, these young kids, when they're 5 years old and 6 years old, they have not yet developed the ability to appreciate the Quran. And so they're going to perhaps memorize some of these things, and they're going to study it, but they will not develop any of the critical thinking skills that he thinks come through language and through mathematics. He goes, if you have this as a foundation, you will really benefit from the study of Quran. So then Ibn Khaldun remarks, he said, this is the best method, in his opinion. But then he says why it doesn't happen. He goes, the reason why it doesn't happen is culture, number one. He goes, the culture is to teach Quran first. And he goes, culture you cannot change. That's what he said. And so he didn't even attempt. He said, this is more powerful than any other argument you can give. But then he says that people had fear. So people, he said, they had fear that, look, when I have children, I control them. We all have, many of us have children. A 5-year-old, you have a 10-year-old who lives in your house, you tell them what to do. He said, if we waited until children were older, and let's say they had learned these things when they're teenagers by this point, we don't know if they're going to want to read the Quran and study the Quran. Right? Now they're autonomous individuals. So we'd rather have them before they move on to their autonomous lives. At the very least, we know we've put some Quran in them, than to jeopardize them learning anything by giving them these things early on. Right? So I don't know. I'd like to get your thoughts a little bit on this. Right? Yeah.
I mean, it's can there be a mixing between the method where you could teach some of the Quran at one point, the small ayahs and some of the concepts? I mean, does it have to be either this or that in this like segregation almost?
Well, I don't think he meant like absolutely not study it, but he meant like in-depth focus and memorization and tafsir will come later. Like learning how to read it is going to come all the way up here as well. And of course, memorization for salah and these things. He meant it wasn't like you don't spend years on that before you move on. So yeah, I think that the middle ground is what he is advocating for. But I find it interesting that this is something, and the reason I wanted this to be part of today's conversation is that when we think about historical Islamic education, everyone thinks that it was one way. And you talk to people who advocate for a traditional method, they always say that, well, look, this is how the tradition was. The tradition never was one thing, right? Every region had a different tradition, and scholars are critical of some of those things. There was no widespread agreement that the method of the Maghribis or of the Africans or of these people are better or worse than others. And I think that's important because today, when we speak about how to educate our kids, we don't have to be on a crutch of saying, well, either we're going to follow the tradition or we're going to be modernist. This is a false argument I think people make because today, I know if I said this, and I'll throw this out there. So today in the education world, this is deeply studied, is what is more beneficial for long-term success? Is it success in reading or success in mathematics? And the literature so far is that mathematics learning early on is more, so teaching a child mathematics in preschool is more predictive of his success in math and reading in the future than if you taught him reading, focus on reading in preschool or in kindergarten. So if you want to know a predictor of a kid's long-term reading success, looking at their early math scores is also very predictive. Right? Now, if you went today to an Islamic school and you said, all right, parents, we're going to teach your kids language and math. And later on, we're going to teach them Quran. You'll have no kids in your school, right? No kids in your school, right? And they'll say, this is a bid'ah school, you know, astaghfirullah. Monogamy he's not from the tradition, right? He's not, right? So this is the whole point, is we need to think a little bit deeply about what is the Torah.
I think
Maybe parallel, but the point is that
she called.
we can speak about. Yeah, there's a
Called
question.
to see. She did.
Somebody joined me.
If you just joined, can you please mute your microphone?
Mm.
So, sorry, you take one more time.
What we're saying is like we should have an Arabic language and Quran parallel.
Sure, perhaps, but I guess the point I wanted to make is that it's okay to debate and discuss these things, and it's all within our tradition to do this, right? And I just don't want to set up this idea of there was a way of schooling, and now we're doing a different way of schooling. There always was different ways of schooling, because every region was different. I think about this. Well, I wonder, why would these cultures be so obsessed with handwriting? Well, this is because at that time, there's no printing press. So handwriting is probably very important. Now, as time moves on, you probably focus what you prioritize. And that's what we need to be talking about. There's a question. Sorry.
You know, when it comes to the styles of if you come across, for example, Ibn Arabi, was he focused more on listening skills than reading and writing in that sequence? So there's a lot of debate about where do you start?
Yeah.
With reading first or listening typically starts first. Reading and writing. It's like Arabic and poetry. When they study Arabic and poetry, they study all skills of Arabic and poetry.
Great question.
Listening, reading, and writing.
So typically what they advocated was that the listening stage, in terms of listening, are you talking about like are you talking about in a formal sense of listening or in an informal?
You say you read the stuff and they just keep listening.
Oh, in that form. I don't know exactly how they broke this up. I don't remember reading specifics about it. But when they speak about language and like detail, from about grammar and these things, that was coming much later. So earlier on, it was just the ability to read the language, right? It was the ability to speak the language, right? And it was the ability to, of course, recite Quran. That's what they initially focused on.
I think Ibn Arabi is not talking about teaching Arabic as second language. He is assuming that the boy or the girl who's coming to the school already knows Arabic. They already have the skills to linguistic skills, to language skills, listening and talking.
I don't know if that's true.
Reading and writing.
I don't know if that's true because the idea was this is the early Kitab system and you have people from all over the world in these different cities. And so not all of them are going to be
but the home has a role.
But they're not all native Arabs. So if you're living in Spain, right, is Arabic going to be your first language? Maybe it's not. So when you go to that at the age of 5, that's why there's going to be formal instruction in language.
Yeah, okay. But in this case, we assume, even in this case, we assume that they focus on the development of the language skills as they are. Listening,
Okay.
speaking, reading,
Sure.
writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay.
Usman,
Yes.
comment. What do you say that if you go to Islamic school today and you try to change things, people are going to pull their kids out? That's fine. I understand that, and it's true. But it seems like when you went to Al-Azhar, they're still teaching the archaic ways. They're saying that you still need to, how many times Ar-Rahman is written this way and how many times. So these things have not really penetrated even the great education institutions like Al-Azhar.
Well, that was the high school levels, just so you know. Of course, the university level things, there are some things that have changed, but I would agree that most universities have been very stagnant in their curriculum. And that is part of the problem we see today, right? Part of the inability of the scholarship to be relevant for the masses is that their curriculums are very archaic.
But the thing is that they are graduating scholars who are coming up, graduating with the same school curriculum, going to teach the same.
For the most part.
For the most part.
No, you're up. That's a problem, right? Yeah. But again, you have to think back, and as I was studying in Azhar, thinking about this, it's a real issue. So I remember I was studying zakat in Azhar. My teacher was from Mali, African scholar. His name was Mali. So a great scholar, a young man in his 30s. When he was teaching us. He was teaching us the of zakat, and he would speak about the animals in particular, right? If you have X amount of sheep, you give. And when he taught it, wallahi, his heart was so into it. He lived in Mali in a village growing up. This is the life, this is the economy that he lived. And so he spoke about it in such a relevant sense. And I'm sitting there wondering to myself, this is really real to him. I wonder if he realizes that for some of us, this is like the most irrelevant thing. Now, my point is not to be critical of him. For him, it was real. But for people like us who come back and live in the West now, well, what is the solution? Well, Azhar is not going to teach, well, I know you live in America, let's teach you all the corporate nuances that are into your things. So can there be a perfect curriculum? I mean, that's a separate question, right? But I think this is why we'll speak about later the need for local institutions. So local institutions can address the disparities that exist between cultures. Yeah?
You said that now they're saying that math is first and the language second, but in that study, they also talk about religious studies as well.
No, of course not. These are all looking at academic.
They're just kind of stopping at that.
Yeah. So I was just comparing those two domains, right? Yeah.
Do we know how strict Ibn Khaldun was in terms of not teaching more than one subject at a time? Was it because there's other Western philosophers of education who say yes, they completely agree, except they say there are different stages. So you can't teach, right, math so long as it's at its romantic stage as opposed to its precision stage.
Okay.
But you can teach math in its romantic stage, and then language not in its romantic stage, but at its precision stage. But I'm wondering if he was.
He did mention a little bit. He mentioned that as a student is older and more capable, he could absorb more than one science at a time. So, but I think earlier on there was more like just focus on one, build that, move on. So.
How successful Ibn Arabi's model was?
Well, I don't know if we exactly know, because this was his like theoretical model. Right? This was like what he believed would have been the best method of instruction.
What's the practice?
But is it he based on?
Well, it's based on the East, but we don't know the outcomes of it. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yes, this might have been happening in some places, but how well it produced scholarship is a whole separate conversation. So, and I'll be very honest. This history of Islamic education is not well written about or documented. Right? We are very good at talking about the history of fiqh, right, and the history of certain ulum, but the study of education as an industry is not actually good. Like to find elements, you have to cut and paste from here and there. Yes. There's not coherent theories that are out there, right? So I just want to compare that quickly. So we talked about Islamic history in the past. Well, now let's quickly move to 21st century America, where most of our kids are being educated, right? And do compare and contrast. So we had no, the state would not intrude at all in the curricula at all. And now, of course, here in the US, we have a highly structured schedule where schools are like, you have no choice. It's 8 o'clock to 2:30 for the most part. You have periods you have to teach. The state controls the curriculum. When I say the state, I mean the nation as well, like the larger state, right? In terms of what content is taught at what point in time. There are state and national standards and testing. So it's very different than what we initially used to have. Moving further, before, parents had absolute choice. I want to send my kid to this kutab, or this madrasa, or to this institution, or to that institution. I can pick this mu'addib. Here, there's very limited school choice, right? And this is something which today has become very contentious, right? You know, the education secretary, Betsy DeVos, it's kind of a huge point between Republicans and Democrats. She's of the opinion that school choice is good. So in other words, if there's Catholic schools out there, if there's any private schools that are out there, the government spends about $8,000 per child every year on like elementary education. So $8,000. So your kid's public school, that's about the cost. So their attitude is, look, give parents a choice. Cut them a check for $4,000 or $5,000 and let them pick what school they want to go to. Because if they're not in the public school, well, we're not having to incur that cost. And that's, the Democrats are really against that, of course, right? But in just going back to this, you have a neighborhood school. You live in this block, you have to put your kid in that school, whether you like the school, whether you don't. In order to get into a different school, you have to really, it becomes a lottery system, so on and so forth. There's limited student autonomy. Again, if you're a student in elementary school or even middle school, you have no choice. Okay? Do your kids ever come home and say they don't like something at school? Yeah? Could they say, well, I'd rather go to this class? They cannot. They cannot pick the teacher they like, cannot pick the school they like, they cannot change their environment, right? The learning is formally limited to academic domains, right? So that's also really important. I say formally because informally they'll teach values, but it's not in the curricula per se. And then the last thing I want to speak about is the role of the teacher. In the modern educational curriculum, the teacher has played this very interesting role where they're not really considered an expert, but their job is to simply transfer information from a curriculum designer. And this is like a big debate in the education industry. Teachers are the most, in all professions, they feel that their territory is the most encroached upon. So if you're a physician, you have some autonomy over how you deal with your patients, right? If you're a lawyer, you have some autonomy in terms of how you deal with your clients. But in a school, you have very little autonomy as a teacher in terms of what you can teach your kids and how you can teach your kids sometimes. And so the idea that is right now in the Western mind of education or in the state is that experts design the curriculum, and your job is to take that curriculum and to just transfer it over to the kid. And this is also very different than how we did things traditionally, which I'll speak about in a minute. So I'll stop for a few minutes. Any questions so far on what we spoke about? So I'm going to shift gears like 100%. We're done with history completely. Yeah.
Do we know where did the U.S. adopted this system? Was it trial and error, or they adopted it?
There's a long history of how it came into being, but just like was mentioned earlier, it has not changed in a few hundred years. So something that said is this was done for economic reasons. It was done because of how cities were organized. There would be a central school that was built. There would usually be one head teacher there, and all the kids would go and they would listen, hundreds of kids. And you could see the old pictures, right? They're just sitting there staring at the teacher with tables and chairs. There's nothing else happening, and that has not changed too much. Now, what is actually very interesting is someone mentioned that if you took a person from 200 years ago, an American kid, and you warped him, into the 21st century, and you put him in the streets, he would be confused out of his mind. Cars, roads, technology, just the way the whole culture is. But you put him in a school, he'll be comfortable, right? This is exactly what I remember, right? The same structure. So it's U.S. education has not changed much at all. And it's a very big critique of it. The U.S. does not rank highly in their K-12 education. They're ranked usually in the 30s and the 40s in their math and their science and their English. And most European countries, Singapore, are way past them. So we know that our schooling system is not good. Now, how to change it? We can talk about that for hours, right? We can talk about it for hours. Right? This is a lot of what I study. So, any questions? Are we good? Okay. I want to switch quickly because I ended on the note of a teacher, where we spoke about what is a teacher in the Western sense. So how is a teacher educated in the U.S.? Typically, they graduate from their undergrad, and they enroll in a credential program, and they finish a year usually, maybe two if it's slow, and they go into teaching. Now, a couple points. Number one is that teacher usually does not come from the highest rankings of the schools. Right? People who are going to, in undergraduate institutions, are going for medicine, right? They're going for law, they're going for engineering. And if you're going to be in the teacher track, you're actually way at the bottom. So I remember in UC Irvine, which is one of the best schools, for becoming a teacher in the region, our criteria is terrible. You can have just in a 3.0 in a field that's not very good. We don't actually get bright people for the most part. Right? There's some exceptions, But the norm of who goes into the teaching profession is not to get the highest caliber of people, which is very different than other countries. In Singapore, in Finland, to be a teacher, you need to be at the same level of your academic knowledge than if you wanted to be a doctor. So you just imagine the difference in systems if everyone in the U.S. that was going to the teaching pool had to be at the level of a doctor or of a lawyer, you'd notice a better, the quality of teaching would go up, no doubt. So I want to go a little bit into this concept in Islam. Like when we talk about a teacher, right? There's a term that is very famous in the literature, is the idea of a Murabbi. That teaching in Islam should not just be the transfer of information, right? The transfer of information can be done a number of ways. But I want to first talk about, well, we need to understand what learning looks like before we have a view of what a teacher is. So there's a lot of ideas in secular traditions and Islamic traditions as to how does a child learn? What does a child bring to his learning environment? So John Locke is one of the famous theorists, and he has this famous idea that a child is a blank slate. That when you have a child, he's completely nothing on him, and a teacher or a parent etches whatever they want into that child to mold them into who they want that child to be. And Ghazali had actually a very similar idea. There's a quote he had that a child is like a precious, uncut jewel, ready to be cut into whatever mold that the environment will cut him into. And if you have that idea of learning or of a child, then it's a very, the idea is that information just gets put onto a child in a very passive sense. So, and this is a question that needs to be asked. Are discrete bits of information meaningful? What do I mean by that? To show you an example. If I take this idea of a camera as a metaphor. A camera comes in megapixels, right? There's millions of dots, right, that formulate this image. Each of the dot, right, think about this as an image. Each of these is what? It's just light that's being recorded in different shapes, right? Now, if I said in any picture, if I said, what does this dot mean, that pixel? Does that pixel have any meaning to a human being? Yes or no? No. It doesn't. The only way that it has meaning is when it's, first of all, there's numerous enough pixels altogether, but it also requires some stimulation for it to have meaning. Right? That it either has to have, prior knowledge that comes into it, has to be something else that drives what someone interprets right from that image. So I'll give you a good example. Have you guys seen that picture? There's different pictures before. If you look at it in like one way, you see like a lady. Look at it another way, you'll see like a cup. Right? There's all these illusions, right? And that's what they're talking about. The mind is not passive in the sense, but it requires some sort of stimulation. So I think that what I wanted to get at really was the way that Islam or any information is often taught like discrete bits of information. So if you take, let's just take mathematics, right? When you learn math, often you're given it that this is how you do these things, right? There's algebra, right? There's trigonometry, there's derivatives, there's integrals. We teach them this is just information that we're giving you, right? In Islamic sense, if you tell someone a hadith here, right, an ayah there, right? You're just giving them information, belief points. And Muslims believe in this. The Prophet ﷺ said this. There's a lot of information we're putting into a child. The question that needs to be asked is that information meaningful to a child in the way that a pixel is meaningless to a person? Are they equivalent, right? And I think that's what needs to be discussed. I'm going to move quick. Yeah. This is really the idea I wanted to get at, is that we need to accept children as involved in this meaning-making process. They are not passive recipients. They're not blank slates. They're bringing a lot to the table. And the whole challenge of teaching is to take this and to convert it to this. Okay? There is an image that you are trying to paint for a child of the world when you're teaching that child anything. But there's a lot of information you're trying to mold, in a sense, to become meaningful. How does this happen? This is a problem of education today. I don't think this has been solved. Right? So even if you take any science, you name it, and you think Islam is the easiest thing to do, like you just take, I always think of this example. How many of you have read Arba'in Nawawiyah, or a little bit, 40 Hadith Imam Nawawi, right? Many of us, right? I think about this text a lot actually, because I think about this text, the idea of it was Imam Nawawi, rahimahullah, a great scholar, found 40 Hadith that he thought could teach the usul of Islam, right? It was comprehensive for teaching Islam in its totality. And he must have had a master framework for picking these 40 hadith, and he organized them in a particular way, and he must have taught them in a particular way, right? But today what's ended up happening is that any of us can go to the bookshelf, pick it up, and we read it, but do we actually understand the totality of Islam of what Imam Nawawi is trying to get at, or do we end up getting this? Right? I just think we get this. Well, I read it and I'm like, okay, there's a hadith about, you know, how to slaughter an animal and to kill it properly, right? There's a hadith early on that umirtu an uqatila an-nas in the beginning. So how do all these fit in to what he's trying to get at? Why these 40? And I think that the problem is, gets to this idea that there's this notion, that, and I'm pulling this from a paper by a scholar, his name is Yadullah Kazmi, scholar, he's at, in Malaysia right now. This idea, he termed the configuration of meaning. He said, look, if you can give a child how to take this information and to organize it in a way that is meaningful, right, you have failed, essentially. So he gave this beautiful example, or I don't know if I, yeah. So you think of a game of football. Right? Football is a common sport that all Americans know. But if you think about watching football, or any sports, cricket, anything, while you're watching that game, there's a whole lot of things that someone who knows the game is doing at once. So when if I put the Super Bowl on the screen, there are a lot of players on one side, a lot of players on another side. There's one ball, right? There's a lot of people standing on the side, right? There's all these lines in the ground. You could be looking at 1,000 places, right? Now, while you're watching, what do you typically watch? Do you just watch the ball? Yes or no? No. You might want to be careful about, do I watch that there's a receiver over there, or there's a trick play that someone is trying to do something else here? There's a lot that's happening. You need to judge as a viewer as to how am I making sense out of what's happening on the field, right? Now, let's go back now to our schoolwork, right? What if a student studied books on football and strategy? So he said, you know what we're going to do? I want to make us experts in football, right? We're going to be experts. So we're going to go and get the NFL rule book, right? We're going to go and get books on how football is played. We're going to get books on strategy, and we're going to study them day after day and night after night. Right? Would any of us achieve a level of expertise if we never watched a game of football? Right? Absolutely not. And it'd be absurd to think that, right? So it's not just knowing the rules, right, that makes it important, but it's actually learning how to make judgments about the game that's happening, right? So you take the Islamic sense, just teaching people knowledge about Islam doesn't give them the ability how to make judgments about what is meaningful, what is not, when do I apply this, when do I not apply that, when should I emphasize this, when should I not emphasize that. And so the problem is not the learning. You can teach someone a fact, but it's how do you make that child understand that this fact matters, and when does that fact matter? And so in this author's perspective, he's going to use this term, he uses the term personalizing knowledge, that knowledge has to be personalized to be meaningful. So if you're going to give any subject its due attention, it has to be something which the student understands. So the whole point for a student is that the teacher he has, the Murabbi, is a living proof of why that knowledge should be accepted. Why does it matter and how does it matter? So I'll give a good example. Perhaps someone has been sitting in a khutbah and they hear the shaykh give a khutbah on tawakkul Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, trusting in Allah, right? And he just read the ayat and he read the hadith, right? In a theoretical sense, you might learn that tawakkul matters in Islam. I've learned that tawakkul is a part of Islam. Do you know how to have tawakkul on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's a completely different field altogether. How could you get it? Now, what if the teacher you had, or the khatib, started to then personalize it? And he started to give you examples of how people have internalized the idea of tawakkul. They were in this, I was in this circumstance, and this was happening to me. And then this happened, and then that happened, and then I drew from this, and I drew from that. And this is how I learned to trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the outcome of me trusting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That could then make the student say, listener, now I know that tawakkul matters, and I know how it matters. I know how to use it. It's a very different notion. And so, and this is why, he wrote at length about the Sahaba, when they would sit and think about, when they would study. Now today, you can go to a seminar and learn the tafsir of a surah in like 3 hours, right? But the Sahaba would spend years on surah, right? You say, why are they spending years and years learning surah, right? And really the idea is that the point is that you're trying to give the student a way to have a configuration of meaning. How do you make sense out of these concepts in their totality? Because that is a precursor to learning. So education and learning are two different things. Education is simply a way to teach somebody to learn. I mean, today in your lives, everyone goes off and they learn all by themselves, right? Most of the learning that you do is independent of a teacher at this point in your life. But you were taught this by somebody over time. So if you can teach a human being how to learn, which means, well, I know what to pay attention to. I know what to focus on. I know what not to focus on. I know when to question something. I know when not to question something. That is a skill that a teacher should be trying to give a student. And this can only be done, this is why I'm going to get to curriculum. It can only be done in a world where the curriculum is the ownership of the Murabbi or the teacher. If I am teaching something, I have to have mastered it, inside and out. And I know exactly why it's organized this way. I know why that information was presented. I know when to stop the child and to question his understanding of a concept. But if the curriculum is the master now, and the teacher is just saying, let's just move along and read this material, they're never able to get this idea of a configuration. I mean, they're never able to say, you know what, I know what to do with, I've learned in this process of, this book is just an example of how to learn, but I've learned how to learn, right? So I know now this teacher showed me that this is when I question, this is when I don't question, this is how I have a conceptual understanding here. So it's much deeper than that, right? Oh, yeah.
So if the teacher has the complete work of curriculum, two teacher teaching political science, for example, Russian politics, will never come up to a conclusion what should be doing.
Okay.
Therefore, the next class that the person goes to cannot have a baseline.
Okay. Good question. So his question is, in a case where there's two instructors who each have two different ways of teaching a subject, how can you allow the teacher to have the autonomy in the curriculum? Because as we move on, there's nothing consistent to share. It's a great question. And this is a challenge of these institutions, right? So I would say, just from my knowledge, is that there doesn't mean there's no curriculum at all. There's core competencies that any teacher wants to drive into a student, right? Now those can be agreed upon high-level objectives. Now the specifics of what text you pick and the method of teaching the student, that should be allowed to vary. So I'll give you an example, I'll go back. If you're in an Islamic school and you say, well, character matters. I want to teach sidq, truthfulness, right? Or tawakkul. Well, if Abu Tariq is an instructor and I'm an instructor and we have our own classes, but we both know we have to achieve these objectives in the curriculum. I have my own text that I have mastered. He has his own text he has mastered. He has a technique that he's comfortable with. I have a technique I'm comfortable with. I have personalized knowledge that I can connect with the students. He has his own personalized knowledge. You can have autonomy while still allowing there to be some shared goal at the end of the day. It is challenging, there's no doubt. But if you think historically, how did this happen? Well, a scholar sits down, he writes a book, right? Ibn Hajar writes Fath al-Bari. He sits in Azhar and he teaches it to his students until they master, and they don't just get the hadith that he had, they understand the big picture. They have the framework of what he intended when he wrote this book. So now when he passes away, they can teach the book understanding the intent of the author. Right? So that method would be allowed, it would work because the ijazah system in that case would permit for the essence of what the goal of the text was to be preserved. It doesn't work if someone writes a book and just gives it to a teacher. And that has now, there's been no transfer between those two individuals, right? And this is why, I'll go back to this, slide on this. He mentioned that education has to be the result of a personal encounter, right, between a teacher and a student. And if you even think the Quran, right, it was between, first between Allah and Adam, right, it was something which, it was a personal encounter that occurred between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Adam, right, or the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right, and Jibreel, right, or the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba, because it wasn't just information, it wasn't just content I can go to a bookshelf and read. It had to be lived. And once it's lived, it could be personalized. Once it can be personalized, you can understand why it matters and how it matters. So, but yeah.
In the American system, you have curriculum.
Yes.
And then you have lesson plans.
Uh-huh.
And the lesson plans are a way to take the knowledge and apply it to the student and have them exercise the understanding and the application.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you go to the university level or higher, this doesn't exist.
Okay.
They throw the book at the instructor, he just teaches it, and he hopes these guys are mature enough to get the idea.
Mm-hmm.
So for the Islamic schools in America, do we have like lesson plans for religious subjects and Arabic and so on?
So the question is, do our Islamic schools have lesson plans that teachers could follow? I can't give a blanket answer as to what every school does. I'm sure some schools have nothing. I'm sure some schools have a little, and some schools have a lot. I would suggest that in our case, this is why I'm a big believer in research. We have to actually go into the schools and figure out what they're doing and document it to know what is the state of education that we have. Right now, the state of Islamic schools is chaos. No one knows what's happening. If it's good, we don't know the good they're doing to replicate it. If it's bad, we don't know that it's bad, and we don't know how to change it. So that right now, I wouldn't have an answer because I don't think that people are allowed to ask those questions usually. And the schools often don't want to share the information because then you're vulnerable, right? If you're a school, I've asked a few principals in Islamic schools, can I come and access can I survey your students? Can I get your data on your students? And a lot of them are like, yeah, exactly, brother. I'm like, we'd love for you to help us, but because you know that all of a sudden, if I'm going to take the data and say, well, you know what, this is what's happening with it. This is what we believe about the school. This is the test results of the children in your school. Well, that's not good. At the fundraiser, it's not going to be very good if there's a report that was an ideal, right? So, but that's when you have to. This is an issue of transparency and honesty, right? That you have it's an amana to teach children. And am I willing to say that are you bold enough to say that I know what's good for these kids, and I don't allow you to actually assess that? If you trust your system, you say, come on in and see what I have to do. And if there's something that's not good, tell me so I can change it, right? So, and this is again the customer-client. I mean, if you're a client of these schools, you should be asking for those things, right? So, yes.
Have you tried new dimensions?
We'll talk about new dimensions another day, inshallah. Yeah.
So there is a question from there.
Oh yes. Okay, great.
Yeah, that's.
Have you found if there's enough resources available for curriculum-wise for Islamic education in America, not coming from overseas?
You're preaching to the choir now, right? So have I found curriculum that I think work? No, but of course many brothers who are sitting here are working on those things, and inshallah there will be. But I'll make a statement. I don't believe there's such thing as a curriculum that works the same way, because it goes back to this idea. Who are the teachers? Who are their students? Students have unique needs. Teachers in the community are unique. Curricula by region is unique. The challenges that we might face in Southern California may not be like what kids are facing in rural parts of America in Islamic schools. And the type of things that I might need to actually introduce in my schooling, I probably never want to put in there. Those kids have never thought about those issues perhaps. So why should I be a fitna and even open doors when they don't need to? So I think we need to be careful about, and again, the questions kind of speak to the way that our country operates. There's this notion that people know schools and that they're just all-knowing being, and then once we tell the schools what to do, that they will succeed. As opposed to there being some sort of an organic ground-up process where, there's people on the ground who should have a say in how their schools are run, and there needs to be a dialogue between people at different levels. Yeah.
I just wanted to share a quick point. As one of my classes, we had a student there who said the one word he really hates, he's an educator, is scalability.
Yeah.
Just because everyone thinks that if something works here, let's scale it and it'll work everywhere else. He says people tend to think of education like engineering or math or something that it's just fixed results that'll come out so long as it goes through this one process. The type of differences we're dealing with, from race issues, ethnicities, to language issues, just local cultures, is so complicated that one thing will never work for everyone. And that's something I think we really have to challenge ourselves to accept, that one thing will never work for everyone.
Yeah, and I think to reiterate your point, this is what science has showed us. Science has shown us so far, at least on education and psychology, that we don't replicate well, right? Because when things work, they work because of nuances specific to that actual environment that it was part of. Now, it doesn't mean there's nothing that's generalizable at all. There's general principles that follow, and that's the way Islam works, right? Think about it. Usul fiqh in the Quran is a body of principles that their specific, realization can vary depending on circumstance. And that's what makes Islam so unique. Right? Had it been like, well, this is the formula that works, and it worked in Mecca, and then you'd say, yeah, this doesn't work anymore. So this is what I think that our religion shows us actually this from a very early perspective. Right? And the early curricula, why did Umar bin Khattab, you would think if anything early on, I think about the time of the Mu'tazilas, right? You think about all the heretical groups that we had. There was never a push like, look, because of all the heresy out there, we're going to force a curriculum down everyone's throat. There was this idea that, this is something where people are autonomous, right? This will sift out, right? People will be able to, there's checks and balances that are in here, and things that are meant to last will last, and things that are meant to die will die, right? But once you say, this is it, I'm going to choose, you can teach that, you cannot teach that, that becomes very, very dangerous, right? It's a very slippery slope, of course, right? I'm going to shift another. So this is the third part. So we spoke, the first 30 minutes was about history of Islamic education. The last few minutes has been about maybe how to conceptualize a teacher. Now I want to switch to a theory on human development, and we're going to bring it all together, inshallah, in the end. So 2 theories I want to speak about today. One of them very briefly, one of them in a lot of detail. One of them is called bioecological theory, and one is called expectancy value theory. So these theories have been pushed over the last few decades, and the notion behind these theories, number one, is that first, there's a lot of theories that are out there, and they're not competing theories necessarily. They're usually working they work with one another. Some emphasize some dimensions over another. The first one, bioecological theory, I think is great to give people a macro perspective on how human beings are influenced. Because when I think about children, my background is more, I do developmental psychology type of work. So I think about how experiences influence children over time. Because nothing is a result of a cross-sectional experience, right? The way that you internalize what I'm saying to you today is going to depend on things that you've heard over the number of years. You might agree with me because of what you learned over the years. You might completely disagree with me because of what you've learned over the years. So this theory, I think, is great in that it shows the nuances about time and about the layers that are embodied in the systems. So the first, bioecological theory, it says that two things influence people. The first is your biology. There's no doubt. So unlike John Locke and Al-Azhar, who said a child is a blank slate, children come with a genetic makeup that is already going to influence a whole lot about who they are. It's going to influence probably what they like. It's going to influence how they think, right? It's going to influence so many dimensions of their personality, their temperament, right? And their openness to experience, right? How inquisitive they are, how passive they are. But this theory, it beautifully lays out, it says, look, at the simplest level, and you could just, like a Russian doll analogy goes outward. A child, he has an immediate environment that touches him, that he physically interacts with. And those have the most impact on the child. So the child's parents, right, the child's teachers, the neighbors, the friends, they have a direct influence on a kid that there's nothing that's mediating. But then they said that beyond that, there's a system, it's called the mesosystem, and that is when people in the microsystem, they communicate. So a child is directly influenced by neighbors who talk to him and his parents who talk to him. But a child is also influenced in a more mediated sense when people in the neighborhood talk to one another, or teachers in the school talk to one another. So does that make sense? The people in the microsystem talk to one another, and that influences the child as well. So in this case, if two parents are speaking to one another about kind of what they want to do with the child, that is going to influence the child through their direct interactions. Right? Then he moves out a little bit further, ecosystem. Because there's other bodies that are out there, like mass media, right? The school board, right? Like what else do we have here? The school, a local government, right? The parents' workplace. All these other things influence the child. So, how many of you have bad days at work? Does anyone ever have a bad day at work? Right? Right. Do your kids ever, are they influenced by your bad day at work? They are, right? If it's to do with the media, right? What you even hear on the media, you heard it. It influences your kids, right? If the local industry that's around, something's happening with jobs in that town, right? If the school board makes a decision, right? Those all influence your child. So there's influences that move out further and further, and then he says finally there's this, he calls it the macro system. These are things you can't even touch. It's culture that's out there. There are bigger ideas that are not something that you can, that is tangible. So there are things to do with, let's say, individuality, right? Or other isms that you might say that are out there that are just trickling down through the exosystem, through the mesosystem, through the microsystem to the child, right? So I think this is a good theory in a very general sense. It gives people a very bird's-eye perspective on how children get influenced through a number of things. But what I want to switch to is, well, that's great, but it doesn't answer specific questions. So the questions I want to speak about today for a child, because the goal of Islamic education, I hope that we have agreed, is not just content. The kid knows his 5 pillars, the kid knows the pillars of Imam, the kid knows the fiqh of A, B, and C. Because knowing it is not the same as doing it, right? And doing it requires a whole lot more. So any kid, as he's growing up, they're asking themselves these questions, or he's not asking it directly, somehow these ideas are boiling within that kid, right? They're wondering who they are, what am I all about, right? What is my place in social groups that I'm a part of? What is important to me? What do I value? What do I want to do with my life? All these questions are happening all the time, from usually in adolescence. You probably think this happens 8 or 9 years old, all the way to the kid is in his 20s probably, and even a little bit longer. So don't get overwhelmed. This is what I want to speak about today. I'll just take a chunk of it. This is a theory that has been developed by my advisor, Dr. Jacqueline Eccles. She's at UC Irvine. She developed this back in the 80s, and it's been worked on over the last few decades. It's one of the most famous theories in in education and psychology and human development, which says, in order a child, what they're going to do in life, the identity that they choose, what they choose to opt into, the choices that they make in life is determined. So this is the choices that they make, their engagement, and their persistence. So this can be in a number of domains. It was developed for academics, but it applies to non-academics, and I'm testing some of that now. There's two major things. I can simplify it just really fast. Here, I'll go back. So a choice that a child makes, the level of his performance, the level of his engagement, is usually predicted by two major psychological dimensions. The first is how much does a child expect to succeed in the task? And you extend that to a human being. Is anyone here an astrophysicist? An astrophysicist? So why did no one in this room go into astrophysics?
Maybe the place where they're brought up didn't give them opportunity.
Okay, so that's a value thing. Now, or how many of you, so a lot of us here are not like theoretical physicists, right? When we choose our careers, one of the components that we chose about what we want to be when we grow up is if we're going to succeed or not. No one picks a career. Like I wanted to be an NBA player when I was a little kid, right? When I was a little boy, like many of your kids, they want to be professional athletes. But then once I realized, when I'm like, a teenager, I'm never going to be a professional athlete, right? My DNA won't allow for it, right? A number of reasons. I had no expectation for success. I X'd that out of my career choice, right? And then I moved on to something I thought I could succeed in. Well, I do good at math. I could be an engineer. Or I do good at English. Maybe I could be a lawyer. And so we make choices. The first thing that's really important is that we have to think we can succeed. No one goes into anything if they think they're going to fail. If they do, it's a personality disorder. Right? The second thing that matters is, do you actually have value for that task that you might choose? And there's a lot of dimensions of values I'll speak about, but very briefly, are you interested in the topic? Does it relate to your identity? Does it have utility for you? And are there any costs associated with it? But I'll go back for a minute. Well, whether or not you think you're good at something, whether or not you value something, that doesn't exist in the vacuum. They're both influenced by a child's goals in life and the self-schemata that person has, right? So they might think about, before they choose if they think they can succeed, right? They might have thought about, as their kids, well, what I want to be when I grow up, right? I might want to be this, I might want to do that. What are the short-term goals or long-term goals? Their personal identity and social identity. So let's just say that maybe I thought I could have been a rapper, right? A lot of little young Muslim boys want to be rappers when they grow up, right? But one of the things clicks in. Even if they think they're good, they might say, you know what? My culture doesn't allow for this, right? Like, the aunties and uncles in the community are not going to be proud of me if I'm a rapper, right? So just the fact that they have a collective social identity as being part of this Muslim community might deter them from a career, right? It might decrease the value they have for it, or it might also influence that, you know what, I can't succeed in this. I have no support, right? I'm not part of a community that could help me inculcate this skill set, right? So that's another thing. Well, where does that come from? The kids' identities and the kids' goals, they come from the child's perception of things. Well, what does the child perceive? Well, what do his parents think? What do his teachers think? What is the what? So in this case, socializers' beliefs, expectations, attitudes, behavior. So what does the parent think the kid is good at? Right? If the parent thinks the kid is good at something, that might influence if the kid thinks he's good at it, even if it's not true. Right? Sometimes we tell our kids, go for it. You can do it, right? And I think sometimes we know deep down the kid probably won't do very good at it, right? But we want to encourage our child. That kid is being manipulated in some way, right? By your own, by your own beliefs, right? Gender roles, right? The child grows up having a role, an idea of gender. So maybe it's the same thing. There's a little girl, right? And she thinks, I love Islam, and I hear the khutbah and it's great. I want to be a khatib when I grow up. And then she stops us, wait a minute. No. Girls don't give khutbahs in Islam, right? So now this is going to influence kind of what are her goals. I don't want to be a khatib anymore. Maybe I don't want to go take a public speaking class, right? Maybe I don't want to do that, right? I'm not going to go to the khatib training seminar. It's not for me. Well, how is this influenced, right? Well, there's a whole lot of cultural factors. So I don't want to go so deep, but the point is there's a lot of factors that move from the culture, right? That influence a child's perceptions, right? That influence his goals, and then it influence directly his beliefs about what he or she should do. Right? A few other points I want to make. There's also a lot of feedback between these. So the socializer's beliefs are going to be influenced by the child. So a parent doesn't think his kid is good at math just because he wants to. There's input from the child, right? Or Quran. If the parent says, I want you to go memorize Quran, well, maybe they realize the kid has got an aptitude for that. And they've seen some skill set in that. So that's also happening. So the kids influence parents, parents influence kids, right? And all that feeds into the system. I'm only going to focus on the last two, these two domains, because I think that's the most, it's the easiest to explain at least right now. So I'm going to speak briefly about these two domains. Those self-concepts of ability are the same as your expectations for succeeding or your self-efficacy and your task values. So these take time to develop, many, many years. And just to give an analogy, this is exactly the research that I do. I study this, how they develop over the lifespan. Kids think they're good at everything when they're young, right? If anyone has a child, they'll say, are you good at math? Yes. Are you good at English? Yes. Are you good at social studies? Yes. Are you good at sports? Yes. Everything is a yes, right? As they get older, right, they begin to realize, wait, I'm not good at everything. And they start to prune and figure out what they're actually good at. And that takes many years. Like I said earlier, they are predictors of choices, right? I mean, if you know how much a kid values something and you know how good they feel about it, right, you can explain quite a bit of their choices. These are influenced by internal and external comparisons. And what this means is that before a child develops an ability belief, am I good at something? He's thinking about a couple of things. Internally, he's thinking, well, what else do I do in life? So let's just say it was, I don't know, let's just take, I do academics, so okay, go back to math, right? So the child says, am I good at math or not? He says, well, how do I do in English? How do I do in science? How do I do in other domains? And he compares within himself what he's good at. That's one way. The other thing he does, he looks externally. Well, how do I do in math relative to my classmates and my friends, right, and everyone else around? So all of these things that are in the environment externally, things that are internal in his own brain, the influence, at the end, what he thinks he's good at. And the same applies for values, right? If I'm interested, if I ask myself, am I really interested, do I want to be, a tafsir major when I go to Al-Azhar? Well, how much am I interested in tafsir versus fiqh? And I start to evaluate that. And so these internal comparisons will influence, as well as external. Well, the other people who I'm studying with, are they more into these things than me or not? If those kids read tafsir 8 hours a day and I only read it 1 hour a day, maybe they're a lot more into it than I am, and that's maybe not for me. Right? The important point is these are subjective. In the psychological world, I'm assuming most of us here work in some, are engineers or IT, or a lot of us go into that field. We like to think very objectively, right? My background is engineering too. You want to have objective reality. Unfortunately, the psychological world doesn't function that way, right? People do things based on subjective feelings, right? So it's not about what's the reality. So in this case, I think earlier, a kid could think he's really good, at math and in English, right? But in his own mind, he's better at one than another. So objectively, he's good at both, but subjectively, he thinks he's a math person or an English person. So these subjective beliefs are very important. So I want to spend most of the time speaking about task values because I think they're the most relevant for us as a Muslim community. The first thing is interest value, also called intrinsic value. We spoke a lot about it last week. As to the idea here is that there should be a level of enjoyment in a person. So people don't choose things that they don't enjoy typically, right? Unless something else is heavier. The second is the utility. How useful is that for somebody? The third is that its attainment or identity value is similar to last week spoke about internalization. And the fourth is the cost. So I'll go through each one, and then we're going to bring it inshallah back together. So interest value. So let's speak about interest. This is the thing that I think we struggle with the most in the Muslim community. When children are interested in something in life, it is not something which is happening just in their own head. It is influenced by their siblings, their neighbors, their classmates, the environment all around them. So what does interest mean? What does it look like? How is it developed? We have to think about this a lot because the biggest challenge I think we have is that Islam right now in the American context is not something interesting for people. Right? I mean, it's interesting to be critical of Islam, but to be a Muslim and to practice Islam and to study Islam typically is not something that the average Muslim kid would say is interesting. So I want to speak a little bit about how can we develop interest in people. So interest, it's got a number of dimensions. There's good feelings, you have to feel good about it, positive affect, and you have to feel intellectually engaged by that as well. Right? That's what it means to be interested. Right? If you're one or the other, you're not really interested, right? You might be curious. Like if you have this, you're curious, right? And if you have this, right, it might make you feel good, right? But it's not necessarily that you have a deep desire to engage with something. So interest refers to the psychological state of engaging with things over time. Okay? So if I said you're interested in the subject, that means you would do it by yourself, right? In your free time, when there's nothing else to do, you would choose that type of task. So with that definition, how many kids do we know that on their own would say, I'm interested in studying Islam? Right? Very few. For them, usually it's something external, right? It's the school homework assignment, the parents are forcing them into it, right? There's some external reward. I remember I was giving a presentation to an Islamic school. They said the way that they get their kids to memorize Quran is by pretty much bribing them, right? It's like, you memorize this and I'll give you $5. You memorize this, I'll give you $5. And I told them, that works great while you're trying to make them memorize the surah. As soon as you're done, right, they're not going to review it. In 5 years, you're going to never have anything to do with this, right? Because it was not driven by anything internal within a person, right? This is a lot. I don't know if I have time to go through all this. So, let's see. Okay. So there's an interesting theory about interest development. And it says that there's 4 phases to develop interest in a topic. And this applies to any domain in life. So the first is that someone has to be triggered in a situation, in a context. So you might be sitting here today. Maybe you had no idea about Islamic education. You had no interest in it. Maybe I have just triggered some situational interest. You're sitting here and you're saying, that is an interesting topic. Right? But you might leave and never touch it again. That means your interest stopped here and it never continued. The next level is what's called maintained situational interest, that you would then at least, in that setting, right, I'll move forward, right, you would actually do something that would facilitate your learning of it. So I'll give a good example of your life, right? Take chemistry. Right? Most kids don't like chemistry. But if I brought a lot of kids into the masjid, so we're going to do a chemistry lesson today, right? They'd all say, oh my God, chemistry? But then if I started mixing chemicals and having explosions, they would all start jumping up and down like, oh my God, this is so cool, right? So that is just this triggered situational interest, right? Now, it's not yet something which we call maintained if they're not willing to do something with it. So now if I said, okay, look, we're going to do some experiments in class for the next hour. I want you guys to mix things and see what blows up and what doesn't blow up and what happens here, what happens there. If I can get them to do that, they're at least maintained in this context, right? The problem is we usually can't get past this. This is as good as we're usually at in education. The challenge is kind of like the idea of internalization. How do you then make it go to something the individual does on his own? And so here, to show some of these, when it is emerging on its own, that means the person themselves is saying, you know what, I remember doing this earlier, and it was interesting. I want to try it again. And so they're self-generating. They might go home and say, I want to Google, chemistry or whatever else we spoke about. And it may or may not then lead to something which is something that they deeply are interested in. And that's reasonable. The kid saw the chemistry explosion. He thought it was cool. He did the homework assignment. He thought it was nice. He Googled it. This is, it's not for me. I don't want to invest in this as a deep interest of mine. That's okay. That's not something which is bad necessarily. But here, when you're maintaining an interest, it means you have knowledge of it because you've been doing this over time, right? You go through it without any sort of external coercion, right? You're willing to go through it even when it's difficult. And that's something which a lot of kids struggle with. When something gets hard, they want to quit, right? And they actually enjoy the challenge. This is what, again, we spoke about last week, this idea of flow sometimes where the challenge that you're in is just right, and that makes you feel like you're really enjoying that experience, right? So it's an equal amount of challenge, right? An equal level of, what is that you mentioned? Is it enjoyment? So the challenge of interest, though, that the literature has found is that if I have a classroom, kids come in varying at their levels of interest. Maybe you're super interested, maybe you're kind of interested, maybe you're completely disinterested in the subject. How do I get children to collectively be interested in something when they're coming in at different levels? So I might then try, okay, let's try different practices, right? I like to say that, so in Islamic sense, right? How many of you know Sheikh Wajdi Ghanim or heard Sheikh Wajdi Ghanim speak? Some of you, right? He's Sheikh Wajdi Ghanim, right? Some of you know him, right? He's very funny, right? He uses humor as a way to get his audience engaged or interested. It also has a double-edged effect when you see Muslim scholars who are funny. People who are not interested say, this is great, he's so entertaining, he's so funny, I found this very engaging. The serious student is sitting there saying he's wasting my time, right? You're sitting and giving these jokes. I could have gotten more knowledge in that time. So a person is stuck. Okay, I got these different people here. You don't care. I need to make this exciting for you. You care too much. I just need to give you the meat. How can I do this, right? And this is always a challenge that happens. So I'll give you some examples just in education literature. In a computer science class, to give you an example they did. They said we had these students, high school students, in a computer science class. Well, the kids weren't different levels of interest. So they tried to do things like extra credit. So the kids who were not interested in the subject did all the stuff because they wanted to get extra credit to get the grade. The kids who were highly interested started to do less work because they felt like they were being coerced, by these external inputs, right? So they found that those who were interested, their work, the quality of work went down. Those who were not interested, they just did it, the assignment to get the grade, but they didn't care at the end of the day anyway, right? The same thing happens with like using colors and pictures. Sometimes we'll try to use colors or pictures to liven up, the book or the presentation. The kids who are not interested find that to be kind of exciting. The kids who are interested find it to be a waste of their time. So this is the challenge that we do have even in Islamic context, is how do we make children and people interested in the subject when they're varying at their levels, right? And there's no answer. I don't think that this field has moved enough to figure this out necessarily, right? But I do think that we have to think about interest, because the big question that I have and I think about is, what is the goal of Islamic education? We know that a child will never achieve scholarship in childhood. We would like children to perhaps be interested enough that in the future they'll re-engage with these topics. So I think that we have this balance that we're trying to strike, is that I can put a lot of content in a kid. It's not that hard to put content in a kid. I can grade him, right? I can have tests, right? I can use external controls. There's a whole lot of ways to make a kid know information. And our kids do it all the time, right? They know all sorts of, obscure facts because they're going to be tested on it, right? They have to do it, and there's no choice. There's punishment if you don't do it, right? But will they ever, down the road, is that going to be a part of their bank of knowledge? Is something which they're ever going to draw from? Will they ever internalize it? Likely it will not happen. They'll have forgotten all of it. Does anyone here remember their calculus they took in college? Honestly. Okay. I took 4. Do you use it every day? No? And you still know it? MashaAllah, it's a bright guy. But typically, we don't, right? I took 4 years of calculus, right? And it kills me that I hardly remember anything, right? 4 years of my life. It wasn't something that was deeply, deeply interesting to me. It wasn't really a part of who I was, and I didn't re-engage with it on my own. I would study it like crazy during the quarter. I'd spend 2 nights not sleeping to master it, and it would be on the paper. I would get my A and be out of my mind, right? And that's unfortunately how most of the education system works, right? And so this is really the challenge. How do we want to? And it's $1 million question. Do you want content, or do you want interest, or can you have both, right? My personal opinion, is we should be focusing on interest. For a child, I don't care what a child remembers. If he's going through elementary school and he remembers the story of the Prophet, it doesn't matter to me. If he remembers all the details of the fiqh, it doesn't matter to me. If he doesn't remember he forgot a pillar, he forgot one of the arkan of Iman, it doesn't matter to me. What I hope is that when the kid moves on and he's out of that school, he has enough knowledge that makes him somewhat functional, but he says, I want to re-engage, I am interested in this thing as a subject. So when he wants to know, he will go up and he'll know. So that kid will say, you know what, I have Google in front of me, right? I have a class that's in the community. I have some opportunity to learn. I want to engage in that by my own choice. Because the other kid could be there. You could have a kid that knew it all, and as soon as he knew it all, he says, I'm never going to go to any of these things. How many kids do we know who after Sunday school say, I'm never going to go to an Islamic talk ever again? Right? Or after, most adults, after the Jummah khutbah, they say, I'm not going to learn. I don't want to hear anything about Islam until next Friday. Right? There's really no interest in the subject. The only thing we've done is we've tried to put content in them through mechanisms that don't support, right, a deeper engagement and an identity of that subject. There's a question. Yeah.
Your example about math, I think it might lead us to understand how can this be implanted. The math you use it has value for your work or something. Like you're a physicist and you don't like math that much, but math is part of the work that leads you to get where you want. So the value for Islam, it's the value of Islam to us.
Good.
Guess that's what you have to still.
Fully agree. So there's multiple components I'm speaking about. The first was just the interest, right? The second that I was speaking about is the utility value of something. Someone may not find, so interest means that you like to engage in it and you want to re-engage in it because there's some level of enjoyment. You know, both psychological enjoyment and cognitive enjoyment, right? The second type of value that one could have is there's this usefulness in it, right? And so we'll say there's a maqsad in this, or there's a hadaf in this, right? That the fact that I know that something is useful motivates me to do it, even if I don't think it's very interesting, right? So I don't think math is interesting per se, but I know it's useful because I want to, you know, make a robot. And making a robot is important to me. And math is useful to make that an end. So that's fine, right? So utilities, and what's interesting is that it's easier to make people think something is useful than to make them interested in something. So it's easier to make someone think something is useful than to make someone believe something is interesting, in long-term interesting, right? And so typically what's done is people try to derive, so it's a strategy that's used now in schools, it's more in research, is that trying to help people derive utility in what they do. So say it can be in Islamic sense, it could be in a secular sense. If you ask somebody, well, you're learning how to do whatever it is, and let's just go back to an academic sense. So you're learning, you know, this math formula, right? How is that useful for you? Can you think of situations where it would be useful for you to use that formula? Now the kid has to scratch his head and say, well, you know what? Okay, what if I wanted to make, you know, this thing at home? Well, I have to know this formula because I have to figure out how much wood to cut and to put together, right? Okay, there's some use in that, right? Or the kid might even think, well, this is useful for me because I want to be an engineering major in college, so I have to know this because I'll be tested on it before I can get into engineering. So kids, having children and human beings derive utility is a very powerful way of increasing their value for something, which will then affect the choices that they make in life, of course, right? Now, what's important is you can have interest and utility, or you can have interest but not utility. So I can think that, give you an example. I think that I'm very interested in basketball, right? I'm interested in playing basketball, I'm interested in watching basketball, but I think it's useless to watch basketball. I mean, honestly, like, what do I get utility other than maybe like it's fun, right? But it's more of interest. It's not useful for anything in my life. So people can have one or the other, but what you need to figure out is, in Islam in particular, what do you want in people? I mean, is it desirable to have more interest? Do you want them to have more utility? Do you want them to have both? These are things that I think we don't have good answers for. Because having utility will make people do things if they have to. Well, I pray because it's useful to pray because it gets me out of hellfire. It's useful, of course, right? It's useful because it makes me, people in the community, right, won't look down upon me because I do these things. There's utility in some of these things, right? But it may not be what's the end goal, is to make people do things out of utility, right? The other problem is if you ask people to do things out of utility, what if you can't derive utility, right? I spoke about this last week, a whole lot of it. It's dangerous to use this as the mechanism because there are certain things that are tawqifiyah, right? And if I cannot derive why I do that, well, I shouldn't stop doing it, of course, right? So this idea is very similar to school. It's the idea of being identified person in integrated regulation. So there was, yeah.
So some kids are more language oriented and some kids are more engineers right from start. So there are certain ways their synapses are formed. And if you're going into medicine, you'll never use calculus, granted.
Sure.
But the act of learning some basics, trigonometry, calculus, even though you'll never use it, arms you with that logical approach of learning something that you may never use. Isn't there value in that?
Yeah, of course. I'm not undermining that you don't study something which you're not going to use. But my point was that if you're not interested in it, you're not going to be engaged in it. So when we talk about Islam in particular, it's okay in my professional career that I've just pruned away all these things that are irrelevant to my life. But you never want that to happen somewhere in an Islamic sense. So it's like you learn these things, but then because you haven't internalized them because you don't really believe in them because you're active on them, that they're gone. So yeah, I learned these things. I learned about the prophets. I learned about fiqh, but it's out of mind, out of sight. No one would say that's healthy, of course.
Well, I was tying it towards your earlier comment. Let's say how, some reasonable amount of time you spent on how in Quran these words are written this way, one in two places. So you learned it, you spent a week on it, it's out, you had that knowledge. There's value in that itself, even though you don't use it every day.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. I think the challenge is the dosage. How much dosage do we put in things that need to be deeply valued and have higher levels of engagement versus things that we don't? Yeah, having exposure is important because now there's a reference point. Right now I can go back and if I see a Quran and something that I know there's some rules on this, I can go back and check it. So, yeah.
The concept that Brother Osman talked about the internalization. After a while, if that happens, then the things that initially you're just doing because you want to get to that goal or the value, it becomes something you like. That's what supposedly internalization is. That you're not just interested in it for some external motivation only, but then it becomes part of your personality.
Yeah.
So maybe something can be flipped. Initially you're looking at the things that make you interested,
sure,
drive you to it, but there is at one point the internalization where it becomes something that you like to be a good Muslim because of all of the things that comes with it.
I agree.
Understanding Islam is part of it.
So what was the last thing there?
Learning Islam,
yes,
and understanding it ultimately becomes something you are driven in, motivated internally to do.
Exactly, which is why those are the experiences, the quality of the experiences is more important than the content of the experiences at times, right? So if that quality is something which makes you want to internalize it, makes you want to re-engage with it, that is what's going to be ultimately fruitful down the road. I'll give you a good example. Many children in the community, I've talked to some of these adults, they're talking about their childhood, how many people say that they have an aversion towards Quran because when they were little, their teacher used to beat them, right? That is our culture. In Muslim countries, is that we spank the kid when he doesn't read well, pull his ear, right? Pakistan, we hang him upside down, right? And you can spank him, right, like this. If you do these type of things, you have to think deeply about what is a long-term. So the kid is going to make sure to not make the mistake the next time he recites it. And the teacher feels great. Look, my method produced the right makharij, right? But you didn't think about 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, what is the child's experience with Quran? What is their relationship with the Quran? Have they internalized love for the Quran? Well, probably not, right? So these are the type of things that we have to struggle with, is that I know there might be a way to get the right product out right now, the right recitation or the proper memorization, but does it facilitate what we want long term? And then you have to ask these questions like, would I rather have a kid who didn't memorize a lot, but he loved the Quran, or a kid who memorized a whole lot, but he doesn't like the Quran? It's very tricky, right? And these are things that we need to think about and talk about. Especially, and I'll get to it here. This idea of attainment value is exactly, I think, what last week's talk was about. That interest is something which you can have interest in something and it's not a part of your identity. That's fine, right? You can have utility in something, right? That is maybe not a big part of your identity. But the identity part is huge, which is, we call it attainment value or identity value, is that having something being important to who you are as a person. Right? So engaging in salah is important to me as a Muslim, right? Attending khutbah is important to me as a Muslim. The tasks that I have a choice over, they matter to my identity, right? This is what attainment value is, right? And this is the part where I think what you're speaking about, you want interest to feed into attainment, or you want utility to feed into attainment, but ultimately this would be the ideal thing. And just so you know, attainment and utility usually go very closely hand in hand. Just for some reason that they stick together well. People who find things very, very useful often internalize those as part of their identity, more often than not, right? So this I don't want to talk about a lot. We spoke about it a lot last week. That's the and I think SDT does a better job of going through the stages of this attainment than expectancy value. Right? The last thing I want to mention, 15 minutes left, and I want to have some time to chat. There's costs to whatever we do in life. Economists talk a lot about cost benefit. Psychologists do as well. We all have limited time in life. We can only choose to do so many things. And our goal as parents and community members is that the children will see that engaging in Islamic activities is not very costly, right? That's the goal. You want to minimize the cost that engaging in this is for a child. But they have to grapple with a whole lot of things. There could be psychological costs, financial costs, or valued alternatives. So if we want a child to say, look, I want you to go and study Islam. I want you to take that class. I want you to read that book. Right? I want you to watch that YouTube video. All these good things that we want for them, they have to figure out in their mind, how costly is it? Well, Baba, if you want me to go to Sunday class from 10 to 1, that's when football is, right? So that's a valued alternative. I really love football. So you're asking me to give up something it's too costly to go to the masjid during that time. And we have to think about that as parents and what are the alternatives that are out there for our kids? And what can we do to minimize the cost?
To go to the masjid.
Right? To go to the masjid, right? That's what you want, right? So there's financial cost sometimes. This is more for like larger decisions of like paying for a degree, right? But there's also psychological costs, right?
Yeah.
If you want a kid to go into something, you have to think about fear. So I was talking to Osman about this I think last year, right? Quran competitions, right? A lot of parents love for their kids to get up in Ramadan and to be in the Quran competition. A lot of kids don't want to be in Quran competitions. Well, it could be because they're not interested. That could be one reason. It could be that they're super interested. They love Quran, but they have a fear of failure. To get up there and to not succeed is so detrimental, right? And they could actually lose value in that completely. You know what? I don't want to cope with that, right? So we need to think about this. There's anticipated anxiety. There's fear of social consequence of success. What if you do something that you're good at, but if you succeed, like people around you, it'll cause a problem, right? So I gave the example earlier, right? What if a sister in the community decided to go and do something that our community wouldn't like, right? To be a singer, right? And she knew she could be a good singer, and she went and wanted to. But then there could be, you know what? I'm interested in singing. My identity as a singer. It's useful for me to sing, like all these things. You know, it's costly. This could really have a cost on my identity, my family, right? There's social consequences for me to succeed in this task. That could also hold someone back from doing something. So very briefly, right, as I conclude this, right, there are so many inputs that we need to think about. And creating an optimal environment is really the challenge. Because ultimately, I want us to think developmentally. We don't want to think about the moment in time. The goal is that a human being is an autonomous human being. They make the healthy choices that they want to make. Not that during the time that we have control over them, that we can say they've done all the right things. So this application that I think about, right? Like, will a child want to memorize Quran? Right? We can use these theories to help inform. Well, how do we make the kid feel like he's good at Quran? Sometimes there's schools that I've been at where I know that the teacher will not let the kid move on until he's mastered, like, the qaida to such an extent the kid is like, I suck at Quran. I can't even start reading Al-Azhar because I've been on this book for the last few years. There's impediments if you make a child feel like he's incapable, right? Same thing, how you discipline him. Do you make it interesting, right? Do you make the child feel like it's costly to engage in it? Will a Muslim adolescent learn to take classes on Islam in his free time? So if that's the goal in the end, is that people will re-engage. Well, what type of environment do I have to set up? That's the next one. I have a whole lot more. So go back to this one. What messages do parents send by their behavior about task values of children? So I went back to my slide. Parents' behaviors influence kids' perceptions and influence how they behave. If a child in the community is seeing, well, my parents, they don't really think that they don't show me for their behavior that engaging in Islamic activities is valuable. Well, that's not going to become a part of their own identity, right? Or in the school sense, my teacher doesn't seem to show a lot of interest in this subject. Well, why should I be interested in this subject? That happens a lot at schools. We have surveys, we have the kids rate how interested they think their teacher is. If the kid thinks a teacher is disinterested in math, they're not going to be interested in math, right? The Sunday school teacher is not interested in Islam, they're not going to be interested in Islam, right? Whatever. And the last thing is, what experiences socialize a child regarding appropriate social norms? I'll get to the last part that I wanted to get to. So the big picture of what I want to drive home is that Islamic education does not happen in one place. These theories tell us, right, whether it be the bioecological theory or expectancy value theory, these happen within vast environments, right? It can be a child in a home, in a school, in a neighborhood, right? There's technology, there's so many things, right? And as a community, we have to not, I think we love masajid and investing in masajid, and then also now we like schools, right? There's some schools that are out there, right? But there's a lot of other environments that are socializing the child, right? So the school is one, the masjid is another. There's after school settings, right? Kids go to Kuman, kids go to all sorts of things after school. There's a vacuum, there's nothing Islamic. There's digital media and technology. Kids learn so much through the games that they play. My daughter loves to, she's 7 years old. She loves to go and play Magic Tree House online. I don't know if kids have read Magic Tree House, right? It's a very famous book series. She'll read the book, she'll go online and she'll play, it's a quiz game for hours, right? Or other things that are like that, right? So there's apps that are out there, there's video games, all of these socialize the kid into what's valuable and what's not, right? So again, I like sports. As a kid, I started playing sports, but I also bought sports video games, right? So I have multiple ways of reinforcing this interest that I have and the value I have for it. There's books. Our children read Harry Potter, right? They read fiction, they read nonfiction. What is available to them in the Islamic domain? If a child wanted to develop a personality as a Muslim, well, what would you tell them to read? Right? it's a challenge. Novels are a part of culture, right? Islamic history had novels as well. There was poetry, right? But what is there in their literature for them? Games, like I mentioned as well, right? And of course, even things like sports and hobbies and special interest groups have an effect on identity. Finally, there's some of you might know we have something called MBL, Muslim Basketball League, right? A number of brothers, they started this about more than 10 years ago. I'd say probably 13, 14 years ago, right? They started this basketball league exclusively for Muslims, and now they've expanded it where teams can have a few non-Muslims on the team. This has had a tremendous impact on the identity of Muslims in the community. There's people who don't pray, who are not practicing at all. They come into this league, they play for a season, they play for 2 seasons, and they slowly begin to develop this Islamic identity. Well, why? Well, all the other teammates are praying, right? All the other teammates are going to the masjid sometimes before Tarawih in Ramadan. Maybe they're having iftar together, maybe they're doing different things. So even things that are not overtly Islamic have an influence on the identity of a child. So what I'm hoping is that we think about these things. And ultimately, this is a few more thoughts, rethinking about how we train teachers. So someone mentioned new dimensions, right, as a school and other schools. Well, who are the teachers in these schools? Most Islamic schools, to my knowledge, the expectation of a teacher is either very little in the past, like 10, 20 years ago, or just any primarily sisters who want to teach had an opportunity, to now it's like just go get a credential, right? So you're a credential teacher, and now that makes you an Islamic school teacher. Well, that's a huge assumption that they're going to learn anything substantively about Islam. I remember my wife, she went with me to Egypt. She went to Al-Azhar, finished high school, did 1 year in the university. She came back, got her credential. She taught in Islamic school for 1 year, social studies and history, right? She told me she could not find one moment to fit anything religious into the entire curriculum because there was standards, right? And there was tests, right? And there was a textbook. And so she's trying to teach like ancient Egypt and ancient Iraq and these places. I told her, so you can do Musa, you can do Ibrahim. I said, all these things. She's like, first of all, I didn't learn it that way. In Azhar didn't teach me that. Number 2, the curriculum allows me the opportunity. So I told her, I said, you're functionally a Muslim teacher, right? You're not teaching the kids Islam in any way, shape, or form. So what do we expect a teacher to know? This idea of the curriculum. Is it fair that a sister or a brother goes to UC Irvine, Cal State Fullerton, they get their credential, and they go to an Islamic school, and now we say, great, our kids can come out with good Islamic values and character? Of course not, right? So I think there's a lot of things we got to talk about. What does it mean to be a teacher in an Islamic setting? At a certain level, what culture should they have? What values should they have? What behavior should they have? Right? And then ultimately, what we have to think about is what are the core competencies and knowledge that should be a part of a curriculum? Right? So the shared values that are not specific, but that any school should want to have. I think a lot of our schools just teach, they're Muslim schools. I say it very bluntly, where we take a bunch of Muslims, we put them in a school, we take a bunch of Muslims, we make them the teachers, and it's business as usual. It's the same schedule, it's the same textbooks often. We tack on an Islamic studies period, and we think that somehow this is going to revolutionize the quality of these children. It is not going to. So the curriculum itself is the biology. Is there an Islamic dimension to it, right? Is the mathematics, is there any Islamic ethos around that, right? Is there character development in these things? There's so many things that we have to think about, right? I don't know if anything else. I do have some more, but I will leave it. We have 5 minutes. I want to give a few minutes for question and answer. I think that we should spend, in the last statement, a lot more money needs to be spent on research. This is my plug. We love to, it's tough to compete. When someone comes to the masjid and says, I have orphans that are dying and I need money for them, it melts your heart, right? People want to get money. But it's tough to say, well, we want to figure out how to educate Muslim children, and that's going to take millions of dollars. And the grants that we use are millions of dollars. So just to give you that snapshot, the data that I work with, I have data on children from the time they were in 5th grade to now they're the age of 45. Every few years, we've surveyed them and their families. I know their school achievement from 5th grade to through college. I know whether they're married or divorced. I know what they thought about gender roles when they were in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade. I know what their parents did. I know what their parents believe. We can do a lot to figure out how people develop. In the Muslim community, and we know, unfortunately, that these theories are very culturally based. Right? I remember my professor who developed this theory, she said she went to China and Japan and said, we don't do things that way. Each nation has a way of operating. In the US, our kids operate the way most Americans operate. That's the culture that they're understanding. These theories can inform how our kids behave, but we need to invest the time and the money to figure it out. So if we figure out, well, we know the level of interest of these kids. We know where they're feeling. We know what they're not getting. Right? we can figure out how to intervene and change the quality of the school. We know what the parents are doing. So sometimes this research is great because it tells you that, look, these parents who did these things, their kids have these fantastic outcomes. And these kids who didn't, parents who didn't do these things, their kids did never achieve their full potential. So we need to know this stuff in order to create curricula, to create teacher training programs, and to create schools, create after-school programs, games, books, novels. There's a lot to develop. The goal that I have is in 50 years, when this, hopefully this, we'll have this thing 50 years later, right? Your kids will be running this program, that there will be all this infrastructure there. There'll be a culture where you say, well, the kid is, the Islamic education of the kid, it involves, well, he has a school he could go to. He has after-school programs, he has sports, he has books, he has novels, he has video games, he has apps, he has all these things. But that takes time, energy, and money that is not as, it doesn't sound as appealing as putting money into some of the things that we currently talk about. So I'll close with that, inshallah, and open it up for questions and discussions. Questions or comments? Yeah.
I think what's missing in all the Islamic schools is having the ends in mind. What defines success as far as the end product? What are we trying to generate? What is the correct Muslim trying to generate or produce to the society? I think that's not well defined. They're more into given an environment, like I said, Islamic environments, teach them the basics, and then the results comes from Allah. They will become good Muslims somehow by magic. Because I think that's a big failure. I think all the Islamic schools I've seen fail to do. What I think you pointed out a very important point is the focus should be to engrave the love for Islam, to engrave the love for example, the Arabic language, give them the tools they could go back and reference and develop later. If you could achieve that goal, that's far more important, in my view, for developing, kids or students or education in general. So that's, to me, that's the most important thing we're lacking.
I fully agree. The question is, how do we do it? And what is the,
That's the difficult part.
So just to throw a plug in there, you said we want to create Islamic environments, right? There's no doubt. That's what the Islamic school is trying to do. You may be surprised, but many of our Islamic schools have more bullying than public schools. Right? So we think the niyyah is there, but we don't. There's a deep level of expertise that's required in order to have the environment you want. And I'll give you just a snapshot of some of that. Why could that occur? Why in an Islamic school where you think you're protecting the kids, do kids report more bullying than if they went to a public school? Well, there's a number of reasons. Number one, so it's parents, right? In Islamic schools, parents can threaten the school to pull their kids out anytime something doesn't happen their way, right? All of you who work in Islamic school or have kids know this is how it works, right? It's like you can't lose that $500 a month, right? Or $1,000 a month. So kids see their parents bullying the teachers and the staff there. The kids bully the kids, and it's the same thing. So they see how our community sometimes is racist as well, right? We make statements about other races and so forth. They do the same thing in school. So the dark-skinned kid is getting made fun of by the light-skinned kid within the same culture. So the same problems we have at a community, they trickle into our school, right? And the goal is we said, well, we want this to be an Islamic environment, and that's why I think we need to stop this question: what is a healthy environment? Can a public school be a healthier environment at a certain time? I think that's possible, right? So my personal, this is what I've done is we put our daughter in public school. She's finishing first grade. We're going to homeschool her next year. Right? There's a number of reasons for that, right? But main reason is that one of the reasons that I think that the public schools just teach your kid how to be a patriot and a citizen. That was like their whole curriculum the whole year. She knows every song, right, about American independence. She knows every major figure, every major event, the Liberty Bell, all the sha'a'ir of being an American, she knows, right? But if you asked her about any of the things about Islam, yeah, she knows because I teach her something, but they're not things she's internalized because it's not a shared environment, right? That like the idea of the Kaaba and of Mecca and some other core concepts and the books and the Declaration of Independence, Constitution is important in her mind, right? She's gotten that. Do our kids read the Quran in that same way, right? That is not going to happen by, any simple fix, right? There's going to be a number of environments that have to reinforce these things one after another. So, and I think that we are underestimating the value of technology, right? Kids spend so much time on technology and apps, and these apps can do a whole lot in inculcating certain beliefs within a child. So, yeah.
Sherman Jackson made a point in one of his recent articles that perhaps we have to also acknowledge the point of diminishing returns. That this culture is so dominant and so diverse and so powerful that we are throwing pebbles at tidal waves. And perhaps that's all we can do is throw pebbles at tidal waves. I give an example just a couple of days ago. My mother-in-law, who's the principal of an Islamic school, called me, emailed me, and showed me an exchange he had with a parent who was complaining that they were having a play at the Islamic school based on the Harry Potter novel, right? And so parents said, how can we teach and have a play where kids are trained to behave like, you know, whatever. I haven't read Harry Potter myself, but the sorcery, the magic, and all of that. And of course, for this parent, this is all kufr. Like, this is kufr. You can't even, you know, some parents have a problem reading these books in Islamic school. This parent was a little different. He was saying, no, I'm talking about the play itself. We are teaching children to act these things out. Yeah. So my mother-in-law came back to me and said, you know, how would you respond to this? I told her, I said, can you pick a different type of play? Does it have to be Harry Potter? And of course, we have no vision and imagination not because we're inept as individuals. It's the social circumstances we find ourselves in. The culture is too dominant. The options we're given is what our lives are defined by. But I did also I challenged her a bit, saying that, look, maybe you can talk to the parent and tell the parent that throughout Islamic history, novels have been taught. Right? That was a way of gaining cultural literacy. It was a way of gaining linguistic literacy as well. Right? The more adept you add with your imagination to do, you know, think about different things. I said, and you know, these are novels. No one comes out of reading these novels saying, I'm going to become a Satanist. I'm going to become a true sorcerer. That's not the problems our children are facing, but our parents are barking up the wrong tree once again. They think that's the identity of what it means to be Muslim and what this Islamic school is supposed to do. So I would say that we also have to redefine of what we're talking about when we're talking about Islamic. What does Islamic mean? Because if we think, because we've read, right, the prophets have mu'jizat, and there are karamat, the awliya, but now, you know, sources and we constantly talk about how this is kufr, this is whatever, but we realize this has that's what we're trained to think about Islam. That's the fact that we don't consider. Then the parents demand these things that, hey, this is un-Islamic. And if our culture was wider, if we had a different circumstance, I think we could easily teach Harry Potter in these schools and do these type of things, because it would be your product in an ecosystem that reflects your values. So what is that point of diminishing return? I think about a lot is that, are we just rubbing up against this to not really get much return?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a pessimistic view, personally. I think there are examples of different communities that have been able to invest. I think about the Mormon community in one way.
Can you repeat the question, please, for those ones?
This question has to do with everything we're speaking about. At a certain point, are there just diminishing returns that you can't overcome this tidal wave of the culture? So my answer would be twofold. Yes, I agree that the culture is immense and it's tough to push back on it, which doesn't mean that, of course, you just give up and just drown. But two, I think that there are examples. We are blessed enough in where we live, the type of community, we can insulate ourselves a little better. I don't mean insulate in the negative way, just like, you know, just kind of put ourselves in ghettos. But like, we're not like in the middle of nowhere where it's few Muslims with no resources that just have to give up. Right? There's enough money, and I think there's enough resources and enough skill set to create a lot of the models that I think we're advocating to create. And there's a lot of money in them. I think it's even to think about like just having a living that's healthy in America. Right? We're pushing our kids all the time as immigrants into being engineers and doctors, because that's the safe money is at. I can say this, and this is being recorded. I can make more money right now as an imam if I wanted to, right? Than if I could have as an